Hi, my name's Marcus Timpson. I'm here on behalf of Futureprint TV. I'm at Fujifilm Ink Solutions Group Application Development Centre in Kent in the UK. And the reason I'm here is I'm going to be tackling a very key issue integral to the success of Inkjet ink development. We're going to be tackling this key question, how to develop inkjet inks for the real world. And I'm joined by three specialists who are really integral to the success of inkjet ink development. To my right, I have Barry, who focuses applied integration, Angie, whose focus is ink formulation, and Richard, whose focus is application development. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to start really by saying imagine I'm an analog, I have an analog production facility, and frankly, over the past 2 years, there's been a huge amount of change, and I'm pretty certain I need to digitize my production. And I've heard that Inkjet is a really good technology, and I should look more into that. Assuming correctly, surely I should start with you, Angie, really, in terms of ink formulation. When I buy analog ink, it's fairly straightforward, and I need an ink. Surely I can just start with you and we can get this sorted. Is that correct?
I'd like to help, Marcus, but in the first stages, you really need to be talking to the application specialist. So I'm going to hand over to Richard.
Thank you. And you're right, Marcus, the initial thought is, you would normally go to a chemist or an ink formulator and what do I need to develop? But in my case, I think coming to me and having those conversations of what am I doing today and what do I want to digitize are really important. And we can sit down and work with you. What are your application space? What are the challenges you have with your current technology? And what can we do with inkjet technology to really help move your business forward in that aspect? And I think one of the key areas for me that is really important is I've been involved in print since I left school. So I've gone through newspaper printing, offset printing, screen printing, and been lucky enough to be involved in inkjet. And for me, it's always been about seeing the transition from each of those technologies, but also the importance of maintaining quality and ensuring that they fulfill the application that they're desired to do.
Right, so it's not as simple as just kind of, I've got an application, surely I just buy an ink. So why is it a bit more complicated?
I think for me, particularly if you're coming from an analog background, Marcus, is you might be used to having a process where you can put ink A on or ink B on with sort of minimal cleanup in between, so you can mix and match. With inkjet, it's a lot of difficulty to change an ink, so you want to make sure your ink is right for what you're trying to do. And then if you think about the process, inkjet is a print head. And the fundamental challenge of that print head compared to analog technologies like flexo or offset or screen is the viscosity. Right. So we really are trying to pack as much technology as we can into such a very small viscosity range. Right, so it's a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable one. Barry, how do you help? Because obviously your colleagues here are saying, look, this isn't straightforward. I mean, you can understand I'm used to just buying ink. How can you help in that process?
Yeah, so it's quite unusual for an ink company to employ a physicist in an engineering role. But what that brings is a totally different perspective. And that perspective is really the viewpoint of the OEM. So my job is to represent the OEM's interests in how to integrate that ink into their process, but also into the infrastructure. As Angie mentioned, the inkjet process revolves around the print head as people conceive it from a hardware point of view, but the ink is actually what ends up on the product. But the print head on its own can't just sit there in space. It needs an architecture around it to make sure that the ink is performing at its optimum. And that's what my group does. We stress test the inks that are developed by Angie's group in reference to their applications from Richard's group, to make sure that it's delivering what the customer requires. And all three of us are in that discussion with the customer to make sure that the customer is updated with developments and understands the consequences of certain decisions as we go through. And that's something that you specialise in, isn't it, Richard?
Yeah, I think it's Barry raises an important point. It's, the ink is on the final product. That's what most people will be left with as a reminder. And they don't necessarily, the end user won't think of the way that ink was delivered on that product. Brand owners don't necessarily care how the colour gets there. In your case, Marcus, it's really understanding what the ink is trying to do for you. So if you're trying to implement something into your traditional analog processes, what capability does that system have today, and what impact does that have on the ink formulation window that we can work within? So I think it's critical that we all sit down together and work through the specification and understand what are you trying to achieve from the get-go.
So with that in mind then, have you occurrences where people have kind of ploughed on ahead with the engineering element of the project and the ink hasn't been really designed at the same time and it's caused a problem? Is that not something that can be fixed by somebody clever like Angie?
There's always room to develop an ink after a system's been designed, but unfortunately then you're limited within the operational window of the system. The print head, the drying capability, maybe the UV system, and the speed that they want to deliver that. We can always supply an ink, but it may not be able to deliver all the parameters that you in your case would need. So I think it's really important that we sometimes take a step back, and if we can't deliver, be honest with you and say we can't do it.
So it might be right, yeah.
So I think one way to visualize it is about operational space. So each of us has an operational space assigned to our discipline with it, and we can move around inside those operational spaces, and that's our expertise. And as the customer, you bring the expertise about your industry and your end utilization, and that's got to overlap with the operational spaces that we have. What we do internally is we take that specification that Richard works with the customer to develop, and we're involved in that consultation. It's not done in isolation, but then we work behind the scenes to make sure that our operational spaces overlap, and it's where that union happens is the sweet spot for operation. And it may be that the customer has a prerequisite which pushes that operational space in a certain direction. And then it's about working between us to find an operational point which allows us to operate together to deliver what the customer wants. And that's not always straightforward, and that can take quite a lengthy process. But we develop skills in-house which allow us to interrogate those operational spaces and bring our expertise and overlay it on the customer's expertise, so that we're not trying to duplicate what the customer's trying to do. We're trying to bring our technology and expertise to the customer in as painless fashion as possible.
And I mean, 'cause one of the things I think that perhaps traditional producers do is they look down their own lens or the analog lens and then look at a digital process as being a kind of replacement to some extent. But what you're saying is actually, in order to realise the value, you need to spend time doing due diligence. It's not, I can't just have an ink for everything, but not only that, I need to spend time solving the right problem. Yeah.
Yeah, so Barry mentioned about those operating spaces. So if you take my role as an ink formulator, it's about getting the performance to match your application. So I really, during that feasibility stage, we need to be having dialogue. What's a must? What's a want? What's not necessary? So I'll give you an example. If you take a black imprinting ink, so that ink, you might be printing QR codes on a pharmaceutical product. It really needs to have dense colour, needs to be readable with the image quality. It needs to have probably a high productivity, so your drying or your curing time needs to be good. What it probably doesn't need is to be super flexible, because you're not printing around bends. But equally, you might need to be able to overprint onto some analog printed substrates. So by understanding what's a must, then I can open that formulation window into that area to meet your application. And I'm not struggling to meet things that maybe are not even a want. It might be something that your analog ink does, it's always done, but you're not using that feature. So why try and build that in and compromise what we're doing in the areas that matter? So for me, that feasibility phase, that constant dialogue is really critical to aligning the functionality of the operational window.
Okay, so obviously I can't have an ink that does everything. And what you're saying is I don't need an ink that does everything. What I do need is an ink that does a specific thing.
We are talking about one ink that is specific for a certain application, but it doesn't mean we should limit ourselves what we can do with the hardware and the ink for other applications. So we can add value to you, in this case, Marcus, to if there was a different application outside of pharmaceutical, what can we do with the hardware from your side, and ink laydown to push you in a different operational space to get more value for different applications.
So you can actually, through the process, end up with a better result with a new idea.
With a new idea, yeah, exactly that, yes.
So it's a bit of a process. It's not as simple as buying. I guess one of the issues for me is, obviously I'm analog, from an analog world. I kind of look at things through analog. What you're intimating is that it's a bit of a mindset shift. It's kind of going, actually, when you think digital, not digital replacement, but digital new, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that follows on something you said right at the start, Richard, about if you start with your hardware, you've fixed that operational space already. So whereas we might benefit from moving into that operational space or capitalising on it, because it's fixed, you're constrained in what we can do. So having these discussions with as little fixed as possible is really beneficial at the start.
Yeah, I guess it's a bit like developing a race car. It's really cool and everything's amazing, and then thinking about the fuel at the end of the process, and it doesn't quite give the performance it could have done if it was designed at the beginning. I don't know if that's a good analogy or not.
It is. It's about not delivering components, okay, and looking at it as a whole. So, for instance, if we left Ange in isolation to make an ink, chemistry is, in my view, a little bit like an art. Yeah, so chemists bring knowledge and expertise, but they also bring artistry into it, in that they formulate inks from an experience perspective. So they bring ingredients together, and if you ask 7 chemists how to formulate an ink, you get 7 different answers. And that doesn't mean that one is better than the other, but how do you then refine that down to a final solution? And you do that by challenging it in the application. So Ange will formulate an ink, and then it will go through our challenging processes to identify the formulation which gives us the widest operational space. And that may not be immediately obvious from the formulation components themselves. That has to be done experimentally, and also from a perspective of experience with it. So again, what we're doing is we're closing down on a solution. And I know that we can be quite frustrating for the chemist, because they want to deliver something which delivers exactly what the customer wants. But then when you actually put it in the printhead and it doesn't deliver from a performance point of view in the jetting characteristics, and we turn around and say, actually, you can't deliver what the customer wants, it then becomes a discussion between the 3 of us about what it is that we think is best compromised in that, and then a discussion back with the customer about whether that fits the application.
I'd agree, because it's really easy for us in the labs to focus on functionality. It's something we can really get our hands on, we can really play to our experience from analogue and digital. But then the product needs to have the image quality and the reliability of use, and that's where you guys really feed into us and help us out.
Yeah, from your perspective, we're on your side. And again, going back to Barry saying we can also be seen as the bad guys, we want to ensure that the product that we're delivering for you is the best it can be. So we will challenge R&D, and we will put them under pressure. Why, going back to the original question, why can't we have an ink that does everything? We will push those boundaries as hard as we can. But we want to ensure that we work with you to do that, and we are, in a sense, the voice of the customer as well.
And you kind of you've hit a couple of things. What are, in your view, the common pitfalls when an analog OEM is starting to look at digital and inkjet specifically? What tend to be the common pitfalls?
So for me, it's a pitfall called technological sublime. People being really ambitious. When you're buying a new mobile phone, you don't buy one which is a few models old. You buy the latest, and it has a status associated with it. And I think people get caught into that when it comes to picking a technology for their inkjet. We want to choose the latest printhead, and we think by choosing the latest printhead, we're actually choosing the best opportunity for success. And the two don't always go together, because it may be that technology is over-spec'd for your application. So we're very, very careful to make sure that we don't become engaged with the technology and forget that actually it's got to deliver something to the customer and to the application. So we keep having to rein ourselves in, and that's something that we're hugely disciplined about. And that's why the three of us work together, because we can reflect back on top of each other about whether we're actually going down that process and becoming a little bit too much going down our own rabbit hole of trying to fix the entire problem with our own operational space, and then making it difficult for the other technology to be able to overlap.
Yeah, it's about real world.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
not kind of slightly fantasy or slightly conceptual. It's
Yeah.
actually real world.
Yeah.
And pitfalls and misconceptions. What's your experience of how things can go wrong and when they don't need to?
I would have said the specification, you know, as I said before, just making sure we're really trying to hit the target and we're not trying to overcomplicate things with functionality that's not required.
So thinking simply
Yeah.
as possible. Richard, in terms of your world?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, as I said in my background, I've always been involved in print, and I think one of the pitfalls I come across is that de-skilling of Inkjet. Is you put a file and you press this big flashy green button and everything comes out lovely. I think there's so many other technologies that are behind what is allowing that image to be formatted on the material, that it's crucial that de-skilling process doesn't get left behind.
I just think as well, you know, the thing that I've learned from working with the chemists in particular is that the process doesn't end with achieving your objective. There's an element that goes on after that, you know, the productization process, which I was totally unaware of coming from an academic background, you know, into this industry. Yeah, and that's something that you're heavily involved with, isn't it, Ange?
Yeah, I mean, when you think again with the process, if you think about viscosity, you know, with a print head.
What's viscosity mean? Thickness?
Thickness, yeah, absolutely. So, you know, you think of an inkjet ink, it's probably 100, 1,000 times thinner than an analog ink. So just a small change in viscosity is actually a large percentage change, and it can really push out your print performance. So it's critical for us that actually once we've got a product that actually gives you the functionality you need, that product can be jetted reliably, you know, for the shelf life of the product. So things like viscosity, particle size, surface tension, everything that's critical for getting those drops out in a reliable and sustainable manner has to be maintained throughout the shelf life of the product. And that actually involves a huge amount of resource, a huge amount of testing. We also have to ensure that the raw materials that come in, again, there's a much narrower tolerance on what you can accept for an inkjet product. So we have to do a lot of failure mode analysis before we take a product forward for productization. But actually, I think from a purist point of view, you could argue, well, that's not the exciting bit. You know, the exciting bit is what's happening on the molecular level, the nanoscale, the chemistry. But for me, seeing a pod of ink or a cartridge of ink, a barrel of ink going out of the door and knowing that that's useful in the real world. You know, that's not just something academic we've invented. We've actually done something that does the job and it can reliably do the job. And that's, you know, I've always had an interest in chemistry, but that's where I get my satisfaction.
Yeah, seeing it working and delivering value and making money for somebody like me, hopefully. Obviously, there are common pitfalls with any project. Richard, give us a bit of an idea of one of your bugbears when it comes to the process of developing new ink that could be avoided.
I think in some instances we have a lot of customers that are moving from analog to inkjet. And the misconception is this hasn't worked in the past. And I think that's because they haven't been helped on that journey. They've been automatically, if you like, given a product and you're on your own now. Within Fujifilm Ink Solutions Group, we can help them through that journey. And once an ink, as Angie was saying earlier, is finalised, we don't then walk away and you're on your own. We're there throughout the journey and continuing to improve and help you through that transition phase as well.
I think that's a really important point, actually. As a company, we've established over the years and our heritage in wide format graphics, all of this internal expertise that we're continuously leveraging. And by developing systems ourselves, we're able then to support other people in their system development and their applications. And it is definitely a partnership, as I see it. And that's why we work so well together, because everybody's got that same perspective.
Yeah, it's very collaborative, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not transactional like I'm used to, frankly, but that's okay.
Yeah, in all my years, Marcus, of formulating for wide format graphics and industrial, I can honestly say in the majority of cases, what's got the ink over the line has been the support of the applications team and the integration team. Or if the ink's good enough, it's got that added benefit. So I think the three working together are really, it's definitely a synergy.
So if we've sort of one piece of advice you would all like to give from your different perspective, for me, starting my journey, what would that be, Ange?
Early engagement. The quicker we can all talk together and think about what you're trying to do and how we can help you from an ink and a system and an application perspective, so that we can, coming back to that operational space, we can start off with the biggest space possible.
Biggest potential, yeah. Barry?
So for me, it's about realistic timescales with it. So we can do many things which we couldn't do before, but there's very rarely a situation where we're able to pick up exactly what we've done in one space and drop it into another space, because people's requirements are so different. And that recognition of that change has a time associated with it. And I think from sometimes when we talk to customers, potential customers, there's an initial disappointment that we don't have something that we can just drop straight in. And through education and through discussion, we can explain why that's the case. And we can work together to actually get that through. But there's an acceptance that there is a time associated with it, with the greater ambition that you have.
That's a bit unfashionable, but with digital, isn't it? Digital's meant to make everything easier and quicker, and it will do.
It will do.
But you need to kind of just be patient, I suppose.
Yeah, you have that due diligence to do. It would be very irresponsible of us to just drop something into your system and, as Richard said, just walk away and leave you to solve all the problems. We've learned from past experiences that that's just not feasible from a success perspective. And that's why we've developed these in-house capabilities. And these capabilities haven't been dropped into this company. They've evolved over time out of necessity. Our roles have completely changed to how they were when we joined the company. And that, again, is just out of necessity. And it seems to work.
Okay, Richard, so a final point from you would like to leave people with?
For me as an application specialist, despite all the technology that goes into the print system, it's the performance of the product in the real world that is really important.
Okay, brilliant. Well, thanks so much for that. Thanks to all of you. How to develop an inkjet ink for the real world. I think we kind of, some key words that sort of sprung to me as you were talking. Openness is really important and critical. Honesty. Me being, I guess, as honest as you in terms of what I need to get from this process. Collaboration. It's not a transactional thing, is it? It's not kind of like I buy one thing and then off I go. Embracing the process. I guess it's a little bit of a journey, isn't it? And then finally, really focusing on the problems and problem solving. And I guess if we do all of those things, we're really heightening our likelihood of success with Inkjet Ink. So thanks again for joining us. We're at Fujifilm Ink Solutions Group Application Development Centre. And that's Marcus Timpson, Futureprint TV.